Okay, the mercy seat. This is where the priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, would sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice. When the Lord would look through, down on the top of the mercy seat, he would see the blood of the sacrifice, and beneath that, symbolically and literally, the broken tablets, or the broken law, the tablets of the broken law would be inside that. So he would see the law covered by the sacrificial blood. And being a mercy seat, it is God's portable throne on the earth. So it's a representation of the presence of God, and he has taken up residence in the realm of the God of this world. The gold calf incident, we see that Egyptian worship has been incorporated into the life of Israel. Their first reaction to Moses being gone for a few days is to create a golden calf. This did not come out of nowhere, although Aaron said it came out of the fire, just jumped out of the fire. It didn't come out of nowhere. This had apparently been, over these hundreds of years, had it been incorporated into the worldview, the Egyptian pantheon and thinking, religious worldview had been incorporated into the life of Israel. And actually, this is going to show up again later, some 600 years. This is going to show up some 600 years later. So they said, "Come make us gods that shall go before us." He received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf, and says, "This is your God, O Israel. This is your God." So they saw that they believed that this was the embodiment, the local dwelling place of the God of the universe. Moses and then later Paul both say that when you worship idols, you worship what? Demons. You're worshiping demons. So when they created this, they were not worshiping the God of heaven. They were actually worshiping demons in the Lord's place. And notice what he says. He built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Yahweh," using the personal name of God and assigning it to the idol. This is your God. So they are treating God, the God of the universe, they are treating him as any other local deity. This is not the first time, or this is not the last time that this will happen. So with the giving of the Mosaic covenant, you have another covenant coming out of judgment. You have a new beginning for the new nation, for the nation of Israel after they've come out of Egypt. And so with the giving of the Mosaic covenant, dispensational transition number 4 is complete, placing us here in the dispensational timeline. You have the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. They should have gone straight up out of Egypt into the Promised Land. As you know, they sent in 12 spies. 10 of the spies came back and said, "Yes, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. We can't take it." Which is quite an amazing thing, because just a few weeks at the most earlier, they had just seen the entire Egyptian army destroyed in a moment of time by the hand of God, and they had on their backs and in their camps all of the wealth of Egypt. They had a daily reminder of, what did they make the gold calf out of? Out of all of the things that they had brought out of Egypt. So they had on their backs this reminder of God's deliverance. Two of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can do this. And if you think about it, it's really so foolish. A couple of things they said. For one thing, there is no way that the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Amalekites, all of those peoples together, would have been no match for the Egyptian empire, right? For the Egyptian army. They would have been no match even if they had come together, let alone picking them off one by one. So it's ultimately foolishness. But there's also 40 years of preservation, and what we find is, as the census was taken coming out of Egypt, around roughly 630,000 men of fighting age, 20 years and above. You have almost exactly the same number going into the Promised Land. 40 years later, almost the exact same number. So God, number-wise, has preserved the nation, with the difference being that, except for two men, everyone who was 20 years and above, all the men who were 20 years and above, died in the wilderness. I had mentioned yesterday about that God's ultimate plan, His desire, His best design, is to care for His people through the creation, not through a continual series of signs and wonders, not through miracles. The creation is designed, man is designed to fit into this creation, and God providentially, it's no less God, but God providentially and sovereignly has set this whole thing up to care for mankind through the creation. And so sometimes people will point to the manna. Okay, manna was intended to be a temporary thing, just a few weeks to get from the Red Sea up through the wilderness into the Promised Land. As you can see, that is quite a wilderness. You can't survive there. Has anybody seen this? Been there? It's a horrible, horrible place. But that which God had intended as a blessing, a temporary blessing, ultimately becomes an instrument of death. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but the manna becomes an instrument of judgment. How many of you have a favorite food? Anybody have a favorite food? Favorite food. Your mom made it, right? And you think, she makes it, you're coming home, and you think, man, you've ever said, I could eat this every day? You ever say that? Yeah. So you have it for lunch, and there's enough for supper, and then you get up the next morning and you ask, are there any leftovers, right? And there's leftovers. And depending on what it is, sometimes the leftovers are better than the original. Chili's one of those things. It gets better, right? So you have it the next day. Morning, noon, evening. Third day. It's the only thing there is in the house. Your favorite food. That's all there is to eat. That's day 3. Now you get to week 1. Same food every day, morning, noon, night. Week 2, same food, morning, noon, night. Month 1. Then 2 months. Then 6 months. Surely there's something else, right? You never want to see your favorite food ever again, right? If you never have it again, it'll be too soon. That's 6 months, then a year, then 2 years, then 5 years, then 10 years. What does the manna do? It is a means by which God preserves the life of all of the fighting men long enough for them to die in the wilderness. So they experience the fullness of the judgment of God by even many of them coming within the sight of the Promised Land. And this wandering in the wilderness is in and of itself a miraculous blindness that God puts over the people. There's no way that they can't find the Promised Land just to the north in any natural setting. They have food, they have water, they have 2 million people, they have scouts. They should be able to get in. But they can't for 40 years. So send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel, and each tribe of your father. So you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. They departed and came back and said, all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, they said, it truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And so the people complained, and they sided with the 10 rather than the 10 spies. The people sided with them rather than with the 2 and God. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Really? You're there already? If only we had died in this wilderness. No, you're not going to die in this wilderness. Not quickly anyway. Some of you will be put to death, but the majority of you will die a slow, natural death over the course of 40 years as God keeps giving you food and water so that you experience the fullness of your judgment here on this earth before you go into an eternal judgment. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we wonder why the wicked prosper, or why God doesn't just take the wicked out of the world. Well, sometimes the wicked are part of the judgment against other wicked. Sometimes the wicked are a part of the discipline that God brings against His people. And sometimes God simply uses this life as a way to begin the punishment that will take place in all of eternity. Experience all the harshness of this life only to die to face an eternal separation from God. And God said, the carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness, all of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above. Verse 33, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years. So once again, we have another apparent victory by Satan. God judges the nation immediately, and thousands die right there. And then for 40 years, the children of Israel cannot enter Canaan, the land that has been promised to Abraham. And so over and over again, the question has to arise, whether it be in the wilderness, whether it be in Egypt, whether it be in Babylon, whether it be under the Assyrian siege, whether it be the Romans in 70 A.D., the question has to come up over and over again. Have we pushed God too far? As a nation, have we pushed God so far that God will no longer uphold His side of the bargain? Have we pushed God to the point where even He will break the Abrahamic covenant and the land covenant and the Davidic covenant and the new covenant? And the answer is no. For any given generation, yes, a given generation can push the Lord too far. But ultimately, God is going to orchestrate things so that ultimately His people will have a place, and it will be fulfilled to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we come to God's ongoing provision for victory with the land covenant at the end of Deuteronomy. It's promises that expand upon the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. So the Abrahamic covenant has three components: land, descendants, and blessing. This expands upon the land promises. This is the second of three eternal unconditional covenants that God gives. Verse 28 of Deuteronomy, verse 1 of Deuteronomy 28. Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all His commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. So In the big scheme of things, the unconditional covenants are just that. They are unconditional and they will be fulfilled. For a given generation to experience the fulfillment of the covenant, there needs to be a faithful nation. And what we'll find is by the time we get to the end of the tribulation period, God will have orchestrated things such that a fulfillment of what we read in Romans at the end of chapter 11 will get to a point in time after the tribulation where all Israel will be saved. Think about this. Jump ahead with me for a moment. How is God going to orchestrate this so that He fulfills these unconditional promises? Remember in Matthew chapter 24, we said as it was in the days of Noah, and one will be taken and one will be left. That taking away, we said yesterday, is as it was the day of Noah, the taking away to judgment. Those judgments are described in Matthew 25. For the nation of Israel, they'll be sent away into outer darkness where there's weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then you have the sheep-goat judgment where the Gentile nations are judged, and those who are judged guilty are cast into Hades, which is made for the devil and his angels. So, when Jesus Christ returns, all unbelievers are taken away to judgment. Well, who's left on the earth alive in their physical bodies? Believers. So for the first time in history, with all unbelievers removed, for the first time in history, every living person on the earth will be a believer. Meaning that every living Jew will be a believer. And when you have a situation where every living Jew is a believer, God has now orchestrated all of this through His blessing and through His judgment, so that now the nation of Israel is set up to receive all of the blessings that God has promised in the Abrahamic, the land, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. So God sovereignly orchestrates this, and yet there is response required on the part of the nation of Israel. And we read from Zechariah, repeated in Revelation, they will look upon the one whom they pierced. And Paul says at the end of Romans chapter 11, all Israel will be saved. In spite of predicted failure, so there will be generations that fail. It shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to carefully observe all His commandments and His statutes which I commanded you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. So again, for any given generation, there must be obedience, but its ultimate fulfillment is going to be dependent upon the faithfulness of God. God will arrange for there to be a faithful nation. Then there's a little detail incorporated into this. Remember, a day of the Lord is when God intervenes directly in history, first to bring judgment, wrath and judgment, followed by restoration and blessing, and you come out with a new beginning. This is the dispensational pattern. This is the day of the Lord pattern. And as part of this judgment that is going to come against the nation, the day of the Lord that is coming against the nation, we read this in Deuteronomy 28:49. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar. So this is going to be the nation, a third-party nation that God is going to use to judge Israel. A nation from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies. And now there's a detail, an odd little detail. A nation whose language you will not understand. Now, if a nation is going to attack you from a long distance away, then naturally they're going to speak a language you don't understand, right? It's going to be a foreign language. So why in the midst of this prophecy of a day of the Lord judgment does God include this detail about this foreign army speaking a language you don't understand? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. We're going to come back to that. For now, we're going to leave it hanging. Through a work of God in the heart, we know that God is going to do a work in the heart as promised in the new covenant. Here is a foreshadow of the new covenant in the land covenant. The new covenant is in Jeremiah 31 and also referred to in Ezekiel 36. The Lord says this, if you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, so I send you away, from there I'll bring you back. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed. And the Lord will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And the greatest commandment, Jesus said, is to what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that is reflected. Jesus reflects what is taught here. God says, after this day of the Lord judgment, there's one coming. There are lesser days of the Lord, and then Joel talks about a great and terrible day of the Lord that's coming. But when the Lord sends you away, there's going to be a new beginning. There's going to be a remnant that He's going to fulfill His promises to. So you have Israel is taken out of the land for a time when they are in Egypt. They are brought back. They are taken out of the land for a time, first by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians, and then they come back. That's 2. Then they are taken out and they are scattered as a result of the Romans attacking and destroying Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D. under the Roman Emperor Titus. That's 3 departures. The Bible only talks about 3 departures and 3 returns. So what we have been witnessing over the last 150 years with the beginning of Zionism in the 1800s, the late 1800s, things happening with the Balfour Declaration of 1917 toward the end of World War I, where Britain said the Jews have a right to a homeland. Then with Israel being established as a state in 1948, I'm not saying these are direct fulfillment of prophecy, but I would put it this way. It is setting the stage for the fulfillment of the prophecies of the final return to the land. Things are being moved into place, and we are beginning to see these glimmers of things happening as God is working through history. Which brings us to the era of Joshua and the Judges. This time period of the conquest and judgment of the conquest of the Promised Land, and then the occupation of the Promised Land for 350 years. So Joshua is on the east side of the Jordan River with the nation of Israel, preparing to go in to take Jericho.
And parts the seas. He said that in slavery. The others chose. This whole city is terrifying, isn't it? How can we fight a people whose God can do that?
So 40 years later, the Canaanites are terrified of the God of Israel. In fact, you can say that these pagans fear the God of Israel more than the children of Israel fear their God.
Then, on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times. Then the priests should make a long blast with the ram's horn. As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, all people shall shout a great shout. Glory will come.
City of Jericho, as you pull up to the city of Jericho, there's a big red sign with white letters. The place that was first occupied by Israel as they came into the Promised Land, it is now held by Arabs. And it is illegal for Israeli citizens to enter into the city. Jericho is the first city. The next city to the west is Ai. But there's a difference, and that is that they lose the first battle of Ai. What's the difference between Jericho and Ai? Well, with Jericho, the people were prepared for what I would call true holy war. People talk a lot about holy war today, jihad. The way it's often defined today, it's when men fight for the honor of their God and strap suicide vests on, kill their children, and fly planes into buildings. That is what is considered holy war today. But that's not true holy war. True holy war is when God fights for His own honor and to protect His people so that He might fulfill His promises to them. You don't prepare for true holy war by sharpening your swords, training your horses, or learning military tactics. You prepare for these battles by preparing your heart before the Lord, and He fights the battles. Notice this, getting ready to go up against Ai, the second city. Do not let all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up. So this is 2,000 or 3,000 men backed up by an army of over 600,000 men. That's pretty good reserves, right? So about 3,000 men went up from there, and they fled before the men, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 men. So you have a battalion of 3,000 men backed up by a military force of over 600,000 men. 36 of this initial attack force die. 36 out of 1,000 is just over 1%. Now, in any battle where you lose 1% of your fighting force, that's a pretty good battle, right? I mean, if you're only going to lose 1%, and yet, in the face of that, backed up by 600,000 men, what happens? They turn tail and run. They struck down 36 men, for they chased them from before the gate as far as Shebarim and struck them down on the descent. Therefore the hearts of the people melted and became like water. What in the world is going on here? They had seen the Egyptian army destroy, the previous generation had. They'd seen the walls of Jericho come down. They had crossed into the Promised Land on dry land as they crossed through the Jordan River basin. And now just 36 out of 3,000 men die, and they become terrified. Why do you think they became terrified at losing just 36 men? I would suggest the only thing that makes sense is that they had never seen an Israelite die in battle before. Why? Because God was fighting the battles. You don't prepare for the battles that God is going to fight by sharpening your sword, training your horses, and learning military tactics. You prepare your heart. You are prepared spiritually. And there was sin in the camp because Achan had taken some of the goods, plunder from Jericho and hid it. God was going to give all of the plunder of Ai to the nation, but all of the plunder of Jericho belonged to God. And Achan had taken and hidden it in his tent. So there was sin in the camp, and they had to root out the sin in the camp so that God would fight the battle. The reason their hearts melted was they knew now that they were not simply fighting the men of Ai, they were fighting the God of Israel. Then with the book of Judges, you have 350 years of apostasy and anarchy. First of all, you have an incomplete conquest issue in chapter 3. This is what we read. Now these are the nations which the Lord left, that He might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. What kind of wars had they not known in Canaan, this new generation? They had not known true holy war, watching God fight the battles. God had fought the battles, and there had been miraculous victory. So God left pockets of resistance. When you get to the end of the book of Joshua, it says he's taken all the land. And some people say, well, see, there, the Abrahamic covenant's already fulfilled there, but that's not true. God left pockets of resistance, and they did not occupy the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. And even within the Promised Land, there were pockets of resistance. Why did God do that? So that this next generation, after Joshua's generation, might know what it means to have God fight their battles for them, which means that they need to be prepared spiritually in order for them to experience this. Verse 4, and they were left that he might test Israel by them to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord. Then you have you have multiple judges, but you have 7 cycles where you find Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and you have what amounts to a day of the Lord type pattern here in these 7 cycles in the book of Judges. You have disobedience, which ultimately brings judgment. Then God provides a deliverer, and you come out the other side with restoration. The nation repents, and then you have restoration and blessing. So the book of Judges is a microcosm of a series of lesser days of the Lord. And I'm not saying that this is intentional. I don't know that this is intentional to reflect the 7 dispensational cycles. There's nothing in Scripture that indicates that it is. But it is an interesting observation that this happens 7 times following a similar pattern. And God's final commentary on the book of Judges, this final commentary on this 350 years is this. The last book in the last verse in Judges says this: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so after the era of Joshua and the Judges, you have come to the point where generations have forgotten the Lord, and everyone does whatever they want, even though God has given them the land and given them victory at every turn. Just a second, I think. Yeah, hang on. So this brings us to the era of the United Kingdom. After the era of the conquest, after the era of the judges, now coming into the time where Israel is in the land and getting ready to establish God's theocracy on the earth.
The prophet Samuel led the Israelites in God's name, but the people wanted more. Someone to lead them in battle.
What do you want? A king?
A king? They become tyrants.
Not if they are chosen by God. Saul, I anoint you the first king of Israel.
May I, as God's prophet, help you in any way I can. You have one task, one simple command from God: destroy Israel.
We followed his commands.
Then what is this bleating of goats in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle and wailing of lambs? Today, God has forsaken you. More divine words. God has torn your power from you. He wants a man after his own heart.
After Saul's disobedience, God commands his prophet Samuel to find a new king.
Young man! What is your name?
David, sir!
I anoint you, David of Bethlehem, to be the next king of Israel. Once Saul is dead.
The Philistine threat continues to grow. Now they have a new champion. Goliath.
Will one of you fight me?
Jerusalem is now David's city, a new center of power for the Israelites, and a home for the ultimate symbol of their bond with God.
Look, my temple, for the ark, for the Lord. The world's never seen anything like it.
The Lord came to me last night.
He's pleased with our work.
The Lord told me the house of David will rule Israel forever.
We are blessed.
Your son will be king. Your son will build the temple.
A kingdom forever. Thank you, Nathan.
Your Majesty, as you requested.
Leave us.
This is wrong.
No one need know.
You took everything from your most loyal servant Uriah. He deserved your respect.
I did respect him.
Really? You took his wife, then you took his life.
Prophet.
You think God doesn't see everything? The Lord has spoken to me. You will bring disaster on your house for the contempt you have shown the Lord.
No.
No. He will take your son.
Even though you are weak, he loves you, David. You have forged God's nation on earth. Take comfort in each other. You will have another son.
Be careful, son.
Let him play. It's the house of the Lord. One day he'll have to build it.
Once again, we come to this conflict of the ages, the spiritual seed of the woman and the spiritual seed of the serpent. You have two kinds of priests during this era. The first part of this era, Samuel, versus Eli and his sons. You have two kinds of kings, David versus Saul. And then you have two phases in Solomon's life. First part when he is given wisdom and he is a great king. And the second part when he becomes an idolater and turns his back on the God of Israel. Satan's relentless attacks continue through Eli and his sons, the ones I call the people's priests. This is what we read in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So what is going on here? In the ancient Near Eastern world, the religious system were made up of what are called fertility cults. Fertility cults is where the worshipers would incorporate sexual activity at the places of pagan worship, at the high places. This may sound a little crude, but what it amounts to is pornography for the gods. It's pornography for the gods. So as the gods observed what the people were doing at the places of worship, they would engage in those things. And when the gods engaged in those things, it would produce fertility for the land. It would produce good crops. It would produce livestock. It would produce rain when it was needed, sun when it was needed, children. So there was fertility throughout the land as a result of the worship of these local deities that were in charge of these various things. So what do we have here? You have the priests of God who are laying with women at the place of the worship of the God of Israel. They have incorporated, it looks like they have incorporated fertility cult practices into the worship of the God of Israel. Extreme wickedness, treating the Lord of the universe as if he's a local deity who's interested in the pornography that his worshipers provide for him. So once again, we have an apparent victory by Satan, treating God as a local deity, treating the ark as a magic talisman. Wherever they would take the ark, God's presence would go with it, so they thought. So they're going to a battle with the Philistines, and in order to defeat the Philistines, they decide that they must take their God into battle to defeat the gods of the Philistines. And the gods of the Philistines would have included Goliath and his 4 brothers, as well as their idols. So as a result, the ark is lost in that battle, and the glory of God has departed from the tabernacle and will not return. God's presence will not return to among his people until the dedication of the new temple in Jerusalem by Solomon. God's provision for victory through Samuel, who is God's prophet. Samuel is the last judge, the first prophet to the kings, and he is a priest. So there are 3 offices in Israel. In the theocracy, in the theocratic government of Israel, the way God would run things, there are 3 offices: prophet, priest, and king. Samuel filled 2 of those. He was a prophet and he was a priest. He was not to be their king. And so he ministered before the Lord even as a child, and was a prophet to Saul, and then a prophet to David. Then Satan's relentless attacks continue, alternating with God's provision for victory. All is not necessarily lost. It depends upon what Saul does with this. And here you have the matter of where God's sovereignty and man's free choice come together And God does not tell us the mechanics of how those work. It just simply shows that both things are true. Saul is the people's king. Verse 5, look, you are old. That's a good way to start. Look, you're old. I'm more often. Look, you're old. Your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. How many would say that Israel made a mistake by going to Samuel and asking for a king? How many think it was a mistake to ask for a king? Anybody? How many think it was okay to ask for a king? How many are determined not to answer any question I ask because you're afraid you're being set up? Because you're being set up. Yes, you are being set up. All right, let's think back to what's the theme of the Bible? God establishing a what? Kingdom of righteousness. And his plan was to have a king, where? On the earth, as his regent over his kingdom on the earth. So in principle, this is where this has always been going. Had Adam not failed, he would have been the king who would live forever as God's regent on the earth. Ultimately, there is going to be a man who is going to sit on the throne of David, right? Who will rule over God's kingdom for how long? For 1,000 years and then forever. So the problem is not that they ask for a king. Notice this. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. In the eyes of the people, the religious and political systems are intertwined. So you have fertility cults incorporated with the religious political system. And in the political system, the kings of the various cities were considered local deities. So the kings of the cities were deities. So what were they asking for? They were asking for a local deity to replace their God. How do we know that that's what's going on? Well, Samuel is upset with this, but God says this. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. So it's always been God's design to have a regent, a king on the earth under his rulership. Saul would not be that man. And many other kings would not be that man because many other kings would worship other gods. And then we read that tomorrow about this time, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Who is saying this? The Lord is saying this. Who is the one who chose Saul to be the first king? God did. So Saul's failure can never be laid at the feet of God. He is God's choice. And that's where we'll pick up after the break.